The State Security Committee of the USSR is established on March 13, 1954. Almost a year earlier, the General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Joseph Stalin, dies. During his 30 years in power, he built a totalitarian system in the Soviet Union that relied primarily on an all-power secret service. At first it was called Cheka, then OGPU, then NKVD, and at the end of his rule, MGB. Stalin called it the naked sword of the proletariat. Already on the day of the dictator's death, a struggle for power began amongst Stalin's associates. Lavrentiy Beria, a member of the Presidium of the CPSU Central Committee, initiates the unification of the Ministries of State Security and Internal Affairs and subordinates them to himself. Feeling threatened, Nikita Khrushchev, secretary of the party's Central Committee, rallies other members of Presidium and organizes a coup with the participation of the military. Beria is arrested and after a while sentenced to death. The MGB was replaced by the State Security Committee under the USSR Cabinet of Ministers. The Secret Service and its archives were purged, as it was a rule since Stalin's era.
The fate of all the heads of state security was actually tragic. They all either died very suddenly, for example, Minzhinsky, or were outright murdered. For example, Yagoda, Yezhov, or Beria. And the executions of the top state security leadership in the Soviet Union continued until 1956.
According to experts, the country's leaders were interested in getting rid of documents and witnesses of their participation in Stalin's crimes.
In fact, in the mid to late 50s, it was decided to destroy those intelligence and operational documents that allegedly slandered honest communists. And a huge amount of those materials were destroyed indeed.
The first head of the committee was Colonel General Ivan Serov, who had joined the NKVD after another purge in 1939. During his Chekist career, he was a direct organizer and executor of a number of punitive operations in the 40s and 50s, the execution of officers of the Polish army, deportation of small peoples, mass political repression in Ukraine. At the very beginning of the so-called Khrushchev thaw, the KGB is involved in suppressing the Hungarian uprising, eliminates resistance movements in Ukraine and in the Baltic states, and continues the Stalinist tradition of political assassinations abroad. In October 1957, KGB agent Bohdan Stashinsky murders Ukrainian publicist and lawyer Lev Rebet in Munich. And in 1959, the leader of the organization of Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera. In 1957, the KGB attempts to eliminate former Soviet intelligence officer Nikolai Khokhlov for refusing to assassinate one of the leaders of the Russian immigration, Georgy Okolovich, and for fleeing to the West. Khokhlov was poisoned with the radioactive isotope, but he survived. Inside the country, the KGB began to expand its opportunities. It was granted the right to form its own bodies of authorities in the Union and autonomous republics, Krais, oblasts, particular cities and districts, military districts, formations and units of the Soviet Army, in the fleets and flotillas of the Navy, in the troops of Ministry of Internal Affairs, rail, water and air transport. Nikita Khrushchev called the KGB a state within a state after the Kremlin uprising in 1964. In September of that year, the CPSU Central Secretary Khrushchev was removed from power by a group of Politburo colleagues: Brezhnev, Kosygin, Suslov, and Podgorny, with the participation of the head of KGB Vladimir Simichastny. Leonid Brezhnev was then elected General Secretary. May 1967, Yuri Andropov is appointed chairman of the Committee for State Security. In his first address to the Central Committee of the party, he proposes to create a new ideological department within the KGB and justifies it as follows.
The reactionary forces of the imperialist camp led by the ruling circles of the United States are constantly increasing their efforts to intensify subversive actions against the Soviet Union. Under the influence of an ideology alien to us, some politically immature Soviet citizens, especially the intelligentsia and youth, are forming a mood of apolitical and nihilistic attitudes.
On June 17th, by resolution of the Central Committee of the CPSU, the 5th Directorate of the KGB and its territorial bodies are created in the interests of raising the level of agent and operational work. General Philip Bobkov was appointed head of the new structure. A year later, Andropov submits a report to Brezhnev on the results of the KGB's work, in which he states that 378 operatives, more than 2,200 agents, and 4,400 so-called proxies are sent to capitalist countries. In the USSR itself, 24,952 agents were recruited. According to historian Volodymyr Tolts, the total number of agents in the country that year was 160,347 people. It was in this year that the KGB under Andropov's leadership took an active part in the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the USSR and Warsaw Pact troops and the suppression of Prague Spring.
So the KGB was, the sword and shield of the party, right? Officially, but in reality, what it was an agency that collected intelligence on what was really going on in society, which was actually difficult to do, and collected intelligence on the country as a whole, and then informed a very cynical leadership about that, and organized underground activities in the West, and organized financial flows to the West, and currency accounts, and all those kinds of things.
The KGB, in cooperation with the International Department of the CPSU Central Committee, sharply intensifies disinformation campaigns in the West, the so-called active measures.
Our television journey through the United States has to come to an end. KGB and GRU officers who were working abroad, yes, they were working under the guise of some position. The most commonly used position was that of a journalist, to be honest. Yes, all those people were considered journalists, either for certain Soviet newspapers or Soviet television.
Essentially, the ideological work of the KGB never stopped. The tactics of propaganda and the goals of propaganda haven't changed very much. There's a history which is worth knowing of a famous Russian conspiracy theory, Soviet conspiracy theory, that was created in the 1980s. And this was the theory that the CIA had invented AIDS, the AIDS virus.
The 5th Directorate of the KGB is also actively engaged in the ideological processing of the Soviet population. Only the politically edited history of the country and its security agencies is spread. Famous artists from various fields are involved in propaganda. Even the prestigious KGB awards in literature and art are introduced. The KGB actively uses punitive methods against the different-minded, from psychological pressure gathering compromising information, civilians, and hindering careers to forced placement in psychiatric clinics. Especially dangerous people were thrown in jail. In September of 1976, Soviet artists Yuri Rybakov and Oleg Volkov made a large inscription on the wall of the Peter and Paul fortress in Leningrad. You crucify freedom, but the human soul knows no shackles. Lieutenant Putin took part in the searches and detentions as evidenced by the discovered protocol. The artists were then convicted, Volkov to 7 years in prison and Rybakov to 6 years.
Secret services, the special services, are very important in Russia. And of course it matters a lot that Putin comes from that tradition. And I think it's that tradition which are the masters of, you don't have to believe in anything, you don't have to do anything, you just have to make it impossible for other people to do anything. That's a KGB tradition.